Welcome to a tactical and philosophical history of Manchester United. I'm Wayne Barton, and this is the Football Taught by Matt Busby podcast. In this episode, I'll be talking about the very origins of Manchester United, back before they were even commonly known as Newton Heath, to when they were Newton Heath, Lancashire and Yorkshire Railway Cricket and Athletic Club. To discuss those days, I'm joined by Charbel Boujaoude, a historian and author who specialises in that period of history. Charbel, how are you doing?
Fine, Wayne. Thank you.
Great. Charbel, today we're going to talk about the club's last ever game as Newton Heath. Obviously, you've written extensively about those periods. One of the foremost experts and authorities on that period. I wanted to talk about the last ever game because I feel like it's got some real significance as far as the club's identity is concerned. And really, in the earlier days, throughout the last decade of the 19th century, football tactics are rudimentary concepts. They're very sort of basic in the way that the game was run, but they had started to evolve a little by the turn of the century. It was throughout the last decade of the 19th century when Newton Heath had become a limited company and entered league football. President Frederick Attock had been resourceful in recruiting some players from Scotland to work in the railway workshops and then playing the team on a Saturday or whatever day they chose to play on. In the very early days of professional football in England, there was this English style of kick and run, or the Scottish style of pass and move. And the Scottish style was seen as the most sophisticated, even scientific by observers. So it's interesting to note that the founding fathers of Newton Heath wanted their reputation to be this way. What was distinct about these early sides, which was forged from them working together really on the railways, was a brotherhood, a togetherness really that went beyond an ordinary sports team, and it manifested itself in a real resourcefulness which carried through, not through just Attock and his presidency, but Alf Albert, who was the first secretary of the club, who worked tirelessly, and then famously around the turn of the century, you've got Louis Rocker starting to become involved. The club, however, did face severe financial difficulties in 1902. They were faced with bankruptcy. Now, we all know the story about Major the St. Bernard and how Harry Stafford and John Henry Davies saved the team. What is less known is the story of the team's last game as Newton Heath, which was the Manchester Senior Cup final on April 26th, 1902. Charbel, I've left you with 20-odd years to go out there in terms of the sort of the formation of the club and the personality of the club in that time. But tell us a little bit about what you understand of what that earliest incarnation of Newton Heath were.
Well, where do I start? I can tell you everything basically. So obviously they started as the employees of a department in the railway. They made bridges and coaches for the trains. They formed a team just to play. They played cricket in the summer. They played football in the winter. At the beginning, they didn't really know how to play football very well. They had their kickouts among each other. And sometimes they would play other departments like Newton Heath local. There's no evidence of that. It's just it's been down the years. And then eventually there was a time when they had players come in from different parts of England who knew the game better. And they're the ones who taught the team how to play. And that's how they improved. There's a couple of players who came from London, actually. They lived in the same parish that Attock, the president of the club, used to live in before he moved to Manchester. And I don't know if there's a connection there, if he knew them or not, because they came all the way from London up to Manchester to Newton Heath to work in the company and to play. And they used to play in the late 1870s among London clubs like Spartan Rovers and Darul Union. So they are credited basically with improving the standards. Of course, back then, there wasn't that much, as you say, they used to call it scientific play, where you pass the ball like the Scottish style, basically. But that kind of started developing later on in the late 1880s when a bunch of Welsh players actually came on board. The captain of Wales was Jack Powell. He came to Newton Heath and he started bringing a lot of internationals from Wales, like Jack Doughty, Roger Doughty, Joe Davis, and they improved Newton Heath to such a level that Newton Heath became the #1 team in Manchester. This was in the late 1880s, and they used to pass the ball from Matthew Ports. The forwards, they had good intricate, play between all of them. The midfielders, or these two, the halfbacks. There's a lot of evidence also of them passing the ball around. Of course, it was mostly, kick it upfield, but there was a lot of, passing involved at that time. Moving on to 1892, when Newton Heath got into the Football League, by then the Welsh influence had kind of subsided. There was only maybe one of the players still at the club. That's when all the Scottish players started coming. So Albert, the first secretary, or basically the manager, but they called him secretary because he had more administrative tasks than actual football tasks. He didn't go to school. He went to school, but he had agents that he would send to get him players. And one of those agents went to Dundee and picked players from the same team and brought them. And those 3 players, 2 of them played in that last game 10 years later. So that was a good investment. Fred Aarons and Jimmy Cooper, they played in the first game in 1892, and then they played in Newton Heath's last ever game, the Manchester Cup final, 10 years later. So that's when the Scottish influence came in. Unfortunately for Newton Heath, by the time they decided to go get Scottish players, all the good ones had been taken, by Preston, the Invincibles, and Bolton. So they basically chopped around in places like Anbank or Glasgow Thistle. That's where they got, most of their players. So they were the best, but they were good players. They had that passing style. Not to say that Newton Heath didn't still, resort to kicking the ball or clearing it as far as possible whenever they were winning and away from home. There's evidence too. At the same time, they used to attack a lot, pass a lot in the early Football League days, 1892 to 1895. They were very attacking. Joe Cassidy, Bob Donaldson, they passed the ball around a lot. They scored a lot of goals. At one point in their first season, they were the highest scoring home team. But then the season got worse and worse and kind of behind. 94, 95, they averaged almost 3 goals a game. Bob Donaldson usually would charge people out of the way, allowing the others to run in. And eventually, as the decade moved on, the team got weaker and weaker, and less of that pressing was noted. The team kind of started to fall apart a bit.
So what brought us to the point where the club went into bankruptcy?
Unluckily for Newton Heath, they lost a lot of revenue, obviously, because of the weather. That's what they, use it as an excuse. A lot of games, it always rained in Manchester, surprise, surprise. And so that affected them. Plus, of course, at the same time, Manchester City had kind of started to rise. And at one point, they were in the first division, which was the top flight back. Of course, they got relegated many times, as is known with City. But because they had emerged as a top flight team, that also affected Newton Heath's finances. Plus, also there was this famous court in 1894 when the club decided to sue a newspaper because they had defamed them, and that cost them a lot of money, and they didn't make any money out of it. All those things together kind of affected the finances of the club. The directors who basically ran the club also were not as competent as they should have been. So with the passing of time, it got to the stage where we're going bankrupt. They owed one of the directors a lot of money, £260, which at the time was a lot of money. And so he decided to sue the club in order to get the money back. This was in 1902, early 1902. So the judge in court, once he found out that Newton Heath didn't have any money, he back the director, Mr. Healy, let him be named and shamed, decided to dissolve the club, basically. And basically, at that point, the players could have left and joined anybody else because there's no more club. But the captain of the team, Harry Stafford, that's when he stepped up and kind of gathered all the players and kept them in the team, except for one player who left, kept the rest, and they end up playing a few games without really have directors or managers or anything. Harry Stafford would would go around houses or send some of his players like Cartwright around, and they would collect money in order for the club to continue playing for a few games. Eventually, he brought on the manager who had been released. He put him on. His name was James West. They went to court and they reformed the club in order to bring the directors and the manager back into the fold. At the same time, he was working on the side to bring in some major investors, John Henry Davis and several of his wealthy friends, and the ones who came did a takeover, put all the money that the club needed, pay off the debts, and kind of saved Newton Heath from going extinct.
Yeah, and I mean the details are in Charbel's books for the finer points of all that, and how the club were renamed into Manchester United, but it came to the end of the season. I mean, what is sort of goes under the radar a little bit is that they did continue the rest of the season as Newton Heath. So the last game that they played as Newton Heath was this Manchester Senior Cup final. The team graphic is on screen, which you'll be able to see. It is Saunders, Stafford, Erentz, Morgan, Griffiths, Cartwright, Schofield, Cooper, Preston, Hayes, Lappin, which tells you a little bit about the tactical approach of football in those days. It's 2-3-5 more or less, but those early football formations would still be 2-1-7. They'd moved into a 2-2-6, and this was probably as conservative as it had ever been. Like Charbel said, the team secretary at the time, who was the de facto manager, was James West. He had succeeded the venerable and resourceful Albert. His footballing philosophy was less notable than his strong personality. He was one of those, alongside Stafford, who was willing to go the extra mile to keep the club floating. And the character, really, of that squad of players could be seen in the last game. And it brings together a storyline, which I absolutely love about this, is that you look at romance throughout the history of Manchester United. You think of Ryan Giggs coming on and equaling Sir Bobby Charlton's goal-scoring appearance record against Wigan, and then beating it against Chelsea as we won the Champions League in 2008. Think of Bobby Charlton himself reaching 749 career appearances for the club. George Best scoring the winning goal in the European Cup final in 1968, and Bobby Charlton 10 years after Munich scoring twice in the final, the first game after Munich. So much romance in United's history, but it kind of starts in this game, really. And I love the story. Erentz, like you said there, he'd been around the club for a decade, been through the toughest days of the club, and he was seen out. This is going to be his last game for the club, the longest serving player at the time, and his last ever game. Newton Heath, they get back into the game. They're 1-1 at half time, and in the second half, they score a penalty. And the scorer is Fred Erentz in his last ever game for the club. Charbel, as someone who's gone into all this history, do you have any more information about Erentz? Because obviously that's his fitting epitaph for the club. And it's a really romantic story to sort of kick off and conclude Newton Heath, really.
Yeah, Fred Erentz, he was with Dundee. Well, the team Dundee that exists today, back then, was two separate teams, and they kind of joined together and became Dundee. Before they joined, he played for one of those two teams, and he's one of the three players that Albert signed in 1892. He was a midfielder, a halfback. He was a fellow for the time. Because everyone back then were smaller than now, but he was considered a big fellow, and he joined, and he was the left midfielder basically. And after a season or so, he lost his place. So in order to remain in the team, he dropped back and started playing left fullback, which was there was only those two defenders. He was the left one, and then Harry Stafford came along, and him and Harry Stafford, they formed Newton Heath's defense for several seasons. And then there was a very capable goalkeeper behind them, Frank Barrett, who was a Scottish international. So the two of them made Newton Heath one of the best, defenses in the league. At one for like 2, 3, 4 seasons, they conceded less goals than anybody else in the league. Of course, they were in the second division, so that kind of helped too. But still, they had very good defense. He ended up playing around or exactly maybe 400 games for the club, and that's counting friendlies, because at that time they played a lot of friendlies in addition to the league games, the competitive games. So that's about 400 games, which was unbelievable at the time. He was, the player with the most appearances for the club. Unfortunately, he had gained a lot of weight. So in addition to being tall, he had increased in other dimensions too. Plus, from playing 400 games, there was a lot of wear and tear, and so his knee was damaged. So basically, when the new regime came in, and they had all that money and they could buy anybody they wanted, they decided they're not going to keep Fred Aarons. So that was his last game. He was a fullback, but he was in charge of penalty kicks at the time. That season, he had already scored a couple of penalty kicks. So when that moment arose, Newton Heath were playing Manchester City, their big rival, who at the time were still a first division team, but they had just got relegated again. And they were playing against Billy Meredith, the superstar of the time. So it was a game, Newton Heath's last ever game. And then they came back from behind. They were losing 1-0 at the beginning. They equalized. They went to second half. And the right winger, Sheffield, broke through into the penalty area. He was hacked down, penalty Newton Heath, and up came Fred Aarons. Fred Aarons, I didn't mention, he was a bit blonde, and that's because originally his ancestry is from Denmark. So that kind of always reminds me of the last moment of the Champions League final when we were losing to Bayern Munich, and a certain blonde big Danish player, came to the front and caused all the ruckus and changed the course of the game. Same thing with Aarons, this big Danish blonde guy came from the back, went up and just slammed the ball in and scored the winner for Newton Heath. It was the last goal under the name Newton Heath, because the next day they changed it. So it was like the most fitting, appropriate finale to the story of Newton Heath.
Well, it really was. Incidentally, the first ever game as Manchester United came at Gainsborough Trinity on September 6th, 1902. Later that year, the game was petering out to a draw until the 86th minute. Talk about romance and history. Debutant Charlie Richards scores a dramatic winner. Richards was an outside right, so these early days of the sport, they didn't have numbers on the shirts, but he would have been the number 7. So you consider the legacy that which would be associated with Manchester United, the number 7 and late winners. You could say the first goal of the rebirth had been every bit as romantic as the last goal of Newton Heath. And that's the story of the tactical evolution of Newton Heath. Subscribe and check out some more episodes in the Football Taught by Matt Busby podcasts to discover more about the tactical, philosophical and cultural identity and history of Manchester United.